Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking wrestling isn't even real to begin with. It's, say it, whisper it, fake, isn't it? Because a lot of people will tell you that there's nothing real to it. It's all scripted, it's all planned ahead, and therefore there can't be any truth to it. But that in itself isn't exactly true. While it may not rely on truth, as the advert will tell you, the hazards are very, very real. Even some of the storylines draw from real life things and put them into the world of wrestling, and it's basically art imitating life at certain points. And more often than not, we find that superstars past and present often find their best moments when they take themselves, they take that little bit of truth, and they turn it up to 11. But some people are so good at lying, in fact, in wrestling, that they actually manage to create a character from complete fiction. Now, some of these are very obvious. Some of them, however, are a little bit more secretive and have only kind of unraveled as the years have gone on and everybody's unfolded kayfabe just that little bit more than it already was. Anyway, with that in mind, I'm Adam Nicholas, and these are 10 wrestling gimmicks based on lies. Number 10, Mr. Perfect. In the 1980s, Curt Hennig came about as close as anyone ever has to reaching the unreachable benchmark of perfection in the eyes of Vince McMahon. And with that, when Curt Hennig was first introduced to the world as Mr. Perfect, you remember the incredible vignettes that came with it, where we saw him as a multi-talented sports star, and it seemed like he could pretty do much anything he wanted, and it was all just at the drop of a hat. He didn't even look like he was breaking a sweat. And long before any of us had even seen him embark upon his undefeated streak on television, we were already thinking, this guy is amazing. He can do absolutely anything, and all, it seems, in one take. But as anybody who works here in this place will tell you, the magic of cameras is quite something. It seems that played a heavy part in Hennig's whole career. In a wonderful set of bloopers that came out on the DVD in 2008, The Life and Times of Mr. Perfect, we saw that actually these things he supposedly got in one were like taking him multiple takes to get. For example, trying to bowl the perfect game in the bowling alley, or trying to clear a billiards table. It all took absolutely ages to achieve, and can you imagine being the guy who was having to film that on the regular and cut out all these extras? My word. Number 9, Ravishing Rick Rude. Now, when the red light came on that camera, Ravishing Rick Rude was Vince McMahon's ideological version of a man. He was hard as nails and he could seduce any woman. He's the kind of guy who would walk in, steal your wife, and then beat up the husband for kicking up a fuss. But behind the scenes, in real life, Richard Rude, the guy who obviously played Ravishing Rick Rude, was apparently far from the character he played on screens. He was very much a family man, although having said that, he was apparently still very much the kind of guy who could kick the living daylights out of you if you got on his wrong side. And one of the people who has endorsed those facts since is Bret Hart, who said in his autobiography, he said he was a great family man. He loved his wife. He was one of those kind of guys who never took his wedding ring off. He put a white piece of tape around it when he went into the ring. Rick Rude was anything but rude. In any circle of friends and phonies, you take the good with the bad, and the bad makes you appreciate the good even more. So it seems that simply ravishing was more than just a slogan, because the real-life Richard Rude made Rick Rude look like the perfect womanizer that every man might want to be. Who knew? Number 8, Yokozuna. Now, wrestling, be it for better or for worse, has always played on a bit of xenophobia, because what's better to sell tickets to Americans than a potential foreign threat who might come in and steal your land? Actually, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? And Yokozuna actually embodied that to a T, because Vince McMahon had scoured through his audience at the time and kind of come up with the idea that there was this anti-Japanese sentiment amongst fans, and what better to rile them up than to create this Japanese heel for some American to eventually squash. His size dictated his gimmick, and his gimmick dictated his size. Yokozuna was billed as a sumo wrestler from Japan, because sumo wrestlers were a big deal, and that seemed like a credible thing to bring to the world of wrestling. So all of a sudden, Rodney Anoa'i, who was of course a Samoan, found himself with a brand new home. Either way, he'd made this Japanese heel, I should say, and fans hated him. And then you throw in there some really ultra-patriotic American like Lex Luger, and all of a sudden, Vince McMahon has got a license to print money. Number 7, Shawn Michaels. As the WWE champion in 1996, Shawn Michaels was being heralded as the leader of the new generation, tasked with leading all of his superstars into battle during a war that they were terribly losing to WCW. But the only problem was Shawn Michaels had precisely one friend in that locker room. Of course, Triple H, the ever-loyal Triple H, we should point out, but everybody else just couldn't get away with him. They loathed his very existence and disliked him so much that any leadership skills just got buried. The rest of his friends and fellow Clique members had already left WWE to go and work for WCW. They were dominating the ratings war, and despite Michaels being tasked to be the leader of the WWE locker room, it's fair to say he wasn't, and everybody who was in there basically tolerated what he could do because he was so good between the ropes. But that was about it. Number 6, the Iron Sheik. Beyond being just a foreign menace heel, the Iron Sheik used to walk around with a gold medal and claim that he had Olympic pedigree on his side. But Kurt Angle, he was not. In real life, he'd gone to the Mexico Games in 1968 as part of Iran's team, and he had helped train some United States teams in the 1970s. But that was pretty much about it. So he didn't have an Olympic gold medal, but on the plus side, at least he was Iranian, right? He was Iranian, that made sense, so he was a bit more authentic than, say, Yokozuna, for example. But when he moved to America, he had become an Iranian American, so I guess all those times we saw him on TV spitting on the American flag were also kinda not true. So not only do we have that, but he hasn't got an Olympic medal either. Fucking bullshit. Number 5, Dolph Ziggler. He's here to show the world, his entrance music will tell you, but Dolph Ziggler's show-off persona is one that seems to have descended into parody after years and years of not being able to reach the heights that we all expected from him. Now, in his defense, Ziggler in the 2010s had actually become a beloved wrestler, and fans were starting to believe that maybe he could be something that the WWE could rely on in the future. His great in-ring work was stellar. His actual all-round solid work as a performer, and not to mention his incredible selling, all had him as this guy who might just be able to get up there alongside CM Punk and possibly put a dent into John Cena's main event run. Unfortunately, it just didn't materialise, and Ziggler was robbed of his only real proper world title run in 2013 when he got an unfortunate head injury. That ruled him out. He had to vacate the title, and as such, Vince McMahon kind of thought, well, maybe he's not the guy. And to be honest, every year since then, we've kind of seen Dolph on all these pointless chases. He's been through a bunch of mid-card title runs as well as chasing the main title that he was never really going to win. And ultimately, in the eyes of everyone, he's just become a bit of a bridesmaid, to the point where he's even been portrayed as a character so bitter by all the things he missed out on when Kofi Kingston finally won. Dolph, all he could seem to muster up was, "It should have been me," and what a terrible, terrible gimmick that was. Number 4, Chief J Strongbow. In the 1920s, Luke Scarbow was a young up-and-coming wrestler who at 19 was already starting to make a bit of a name for himself in the National Wrestling Alliance. Going by his middle name Joe, he didn't really have to betray too much of his New Jersey roots, and we found him as this grizzled young veteran from the Northeast who was making his way through the Southern Territories and catching a few people's eye. Then Vince McMahon Sr. found him and decided to give him a headdress. We saw a transformation from New Jersey Joe across to Native American Strongbow, and that is quite the difference. And as you can imagine, with a gimmick like that, everything that he did kind of came with all the bells and whistles of a stereotypical Native American. His moveset was themed around it, everything like that. And actually, funnily enough, he actually started to make a bit of a name for himself in New York. Now, his actual roots to the New Jersey, New York area were kept very quiet indeed. And for all intents and purposes, this was a real deal Native American, and genuinely, people were buying into this. The audiences were lapping it up. Alongside the likes of Billy White Wolf and Jules Strongbow, of course, similarly themed kind of wrestlers alongside him, he had some great runs in the tag team division for both the WWF and the WWF. And this was actually a persona that he managed to keep fairly well reserved even into his retirement, and we would find him actually turning up in the 90s even, linking arms with the modern equivalent of that, which was of course Tatanka. Number 3, Sgt Slaughter. Sgt Slaughter's stolen valor may actually be one of the most unique skeletons in a WWE wrestler's closet that we've ever seen in the modern era. Sgt Slaughter enjoyed a ton of success with his military gimmick, and it was all based around the fact that he had this sort of undisclosed past in the military, and everyone kind of flocked around it because it felt authentic, even to the point where he was actually working alongside G.I. Joe, a real American hero, on TV. And that's incredible when you think about it. This guy is the epitome of the military, of the army, and everyone was flocking towards this incredible gimmick. Now, we should probably point out that it's never actually been part of the remit that you had to be specifically telling the truth when you tell people what your background is and who you are as a person maybe in real life. But that said, with Sgt Slaughter's introduction and having a gimmick that was so centered around this, it meant that as a caveat, he'd have to protect that lie at all costs. And it seems like he did a fairly good job. Right up until recently. Because yes, as we mentioned earlier, in 2019, there was a huge uproar in the wrestling community because it turned out that Sgt Slaughter's valor had in fact been stolen. Number 2, Lance Von Erich. Now, Lance Von Erich was a failed attempt by Fritz Von Erich to kind of look after his locals while his popular sons, Kevin and Kerry, were wrestling elsewhere. This guy hadn't actually come from Atkinson stock. He was one of two, not two, but he kind of made out like he had, and this would have worked if it had caught on with audiences. Under pressure from a rising WWF, the WCCW head honcho Von Erich decided that he had to introduce something to try and make it work while Kerry and Kevin weren't there. So in steps Lance, another fraudulent brother, alongside Waldo, and the pair of them had been introduced to try and kind of make up for the fact that another brother, Mike, was also out with toxic shock syndrome. Unfortunately, Lance's presence came at a time when a real sadness was only just beginning to befall one of wrestling's favourite families in the form of the Von Erichs. The use of a fake Von Erich severed a tie with the audience, and the brothers themselves were fatally separated through a bunch of trials, tribulations and tragedies that befell the family. Now, that said, a feud with the fabulous Freebirds would set the Dallas territories on fire, but sadly Lance was always going to be considered as not as good as the other Von Erichs. They knew what he was about, and a fraudulent character they just weren't that interested in, and rightly so, to be honest. The Von Erichs were the Von Erichs. You can't replace them. And number 1, George the Animal Steele. Now, standard wrestling logic states that the best characters within wrestling are those who take their real life components and turn them up to 11. Now, despite being covered in hair and able to play a deranged and eventually lovable monster, Jim Myers wasn't that at all. That wasn't his usual gimmick. His actual real life thing was he was a teacher, and that was a far cry from being some kind of raging monster. But ironically, before being the Animal, he did actually try to tap into his school teacher background. He would become a character known as the Student when he first started, where he wore a mask to try and hide his identity so he could keep both of his lives separate. But upon embracing wrestling as a full-time profession, he decided to put away all the school stuff, knock the student gimmick on the head, and just be who he was at heart, which was apparently a big, hairy, scary dude with a bit of a deranged nature. Guess he was kind of a monster as well, and had a green tongue? Imagine hanging out with him at the weekends, man. That would be so weird. So that's it, there you have it. Those are 10 wrestling gimmicks based on lies, but I'm sure in the world of wrestling that there are definitely more than 10. So if we've missed any ones that you think are a little bit better, let us know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like and share. Hit the old subscribe button if you haven't already. You can find the original article for this at whatculture.com. Go and give that a read. It's by Michael Hamflett. It's lovely. You can follow What Culture on Twitter at WhatCultureWWE. You can follow me on Twitter if that's your thing at It's Adam Nicholas, or if you just want to watch some more videos, you should be able to find some just over here. I'm Adam Nicholas. This has been What Culture Wrestling, and I'll see you next time.